Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and wherever we are, happens to be morning. This is Sally Ember, EDD, with my guest today on episode 43 in September of 2015, the very last day, September 30th, on changes, conversations between authors. Welcome, Michael Stephen Daigle.
Good morning, Sally. Thank you very much for this chance to talk. Looking forward to it, and hello out there in the internet. Hope you enjoy our conversation.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. People could be on their phones, on Twitter, on a pad or tablet of some kind, on a computer, a desktop, on devices I haven't even heard about yet. Probably they're wired into their brains. I don't even know. And in the future, you know, however people are going to watch YouTube will be on. And so even though this is 2015, I don't know what day or what year you're watching, but if you're live, please go to the Google Plus event page and give us a comment, tell us you're here, ask a question, and I will see it with this lovely little app called the Comment Tracker. But if you're on YouTube or some other version embedded somewhere, I won't see your comments while we're live. So if you want to interact with us, which we'd love for you to do, please make your way over to the Google Plus event page for episode 43 of Changes. 10 o'clock Eastern time is the way we are now broadcasting live. So here we are. We have a person on my show today who has many hats from his life now and in the past, all having to do with writing. So nonfiction, fiction, on-the-spot reporting. Before we went live, he was just telling me about a 500-year flood that he helped to manage the information dissemination for before cell phones, before internet, before we had a lot of ways to connect with each other across space and time. And that was in Maine in what, 1987, Michael?
Yeah, it was 1987. It turned out that as I was explaining, Maine is always a snowy winter. The mountains get a lot of snow, which keeps the ski areas in business. But we were in Waterville. We're sort of at the beginning of the coastal plain, and there's always a big temperature difference. The mountains were in the 20s. We were in the 40s. We got rain. They got snow, and then it warmed up, and the snowpack just melted. Between heavy rain and 50-degree temperatures, 8 feet of snow melted in a couple of days, flowing downhill, heading to the water, washing out bridges and roads, and a couple of historic, covered bridges got knocked out. Isolation everywhere. People were trying to drive. One of the things that I was doing was coordinating where our reporters and correspondents lived, and first finding out if they were safe, but then trying to figure out how they got around, what roads were open, what bridges were not closed. And we had this map and a list of stuff all over the place. And this was all done without cell phones. So people are driving from location to location looking for payphones, which in rural Maine don't exist. You know, so maybe they'd go to the gas station and make a call, or maybe they'd go to a friend's house and make a call. And you just gradually put all of this information together. We also didn't have the internet, so you couldn't do research. You know, right now, this kind of a story would happen, and you'd assign 2 people to do a quick historical internet search to find out the last time there was this big flood.
Exactly.
Well, it turned out the last big flood like this was 1938, and I actually knew people who lived there and were 10 or 12 years old at the time. And how they made money was after the flood, because it came in the spring in April. Back in 1938, the logging companies would bring all of the logs into the river and build them in what were called cribs. And then they would tie them up, and the log drivers, who are probably the craziest people I've ever met, because I talked to a few of them, they're standing out in front on the lead log with something called the PV, which is basically just a stick with a point, in front of 200,000 tons of logs floating independently, sort of wrapped in this log blanket, and they're pulling them down the river. But in 1938, when the flood hit, it lifted all the cribs out of the water and scattered the wood all over the place. And so my stepmother's brother and his friends made money by going into the woods and for 10 cents a log, hauling all that wood back into the river because it was worth millions and millions of dollars to the power company or to
Now,
the
just to
logging
give
company.
people a picture of this who aren't familiar with what you're talking about,
Yeah.
how long and how round a circumference would a so-called log be? We're not talking about fireplace logs here.
No, we're talking about logs generally 3 to 4 feet wide, 50 feet long,
It's
and
basically a trunk of a tree.
a trunk of a tree, because they would process them enough so that they would float easily. I mean, they trimmed off all the loose branches, but essentially it's the trunk of a tree. And certainly back in 1938, where there was a lot more old growth, these things were very big. Today, they do it by truck, but the logs are probably 2 feet wide. But still, you've got 250,000 of them.
Right, and so 10 cents a log would require what? Donkeys, horses, sleighs, dragging
horses,
equipment, 5 or 10 men per log.
Yep.
Right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's really amazing that they even could do it at all.
They cut, now they do it mechanically, but back then it would be, 50 guys with chainsaws. And you're out there, and that's why up in northern Maine, the logging camps up in Aroostook County are just famous. These guys would move in and they would stay there for 5 months at a time during the cutting season. And then they'd take a break when it got real muddy in the spring and then real muddy in the fall. But then they'd come back in the winter because it was easier to get around the woods when there was 3 feet of frozen snow on the ground. And I mean, that was the industry. And back then, you put some. The roads weren't real good, but the rivers were there. So, and actually, until they floated logs down the Kennebec River in Skowhegan to a paper mill up until 1975.
And that's where we get the expression log jam.
Log jam, right.
Which is when the logs that are supposed to all stay parallel and not bump into each other would not stay parallel and would either bump into another pile or start bumping into each other.
Absolutely. Or
and block the river.
Or a rock would show up, anything to disrupt the smooth flow of these logs. You tip the log this way, the guy out in the front would be launched into the water, and his responsibility was somehow how to avoid all of those logs hitting him in the head. It was probably the most hazardous job anyone could have ever devised.
Unbelievable.
And you can go to LL Bean and buy a river driver's shirt today, and that's some of the legacy of what they wore. Crazy business. But guess what? When you're out there in the woods and you're sort of a pioneer, you did what you had to do. And you just, and I talked to some of these guys and just, you just shake your head at the stories, because every one of these guys got dumped into the river at some point or got caught on a runaway log doing 40 miles an hour down the river.
Yeah, and then let's remind people, this is not a pleasant place to swim. The river's about 45 degrees if you're lucky at that time of year. So if you're in it for more than 2 minutes, you're dead. It's hypothermia.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. You've got big, heavy boots that are probably 10 pounds each with huge spikes on them and several layers of clothes, and which immediately would just suck up the water and you're a dead weight. And you've got this, and you have this log jam the size of Rhode Island chasing you down the river.
Unbelievable. And the expression we had, I lived in New England, up in northern New England, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont for over 21 years. And the expression we had about what are the seasons like was 10 months of winter and 2 months of mighty hard sledding. Yep,
that's true. Absolutely.
Which we call mud season.
Absolutely. Mud season was great. Actually, the thing that what we liked about covering government in Maine is that back then it was still town meeting season. Town meeting is a form of government that goes back to the Revolutionary days. The town literally would come together in a meeting hall once a year and elect its officials and set a budget, and in modern times would sort of pick out the projects that were going to be done. And some of the best fights in these town meetings in small towns was whose road was going to get fixed, and entire elections were swung for town council based on whether you're going to do the road on the west side of town or the road on the east side of town.
Right, and whether or not to put in a traffic light and whose store would benefit.
Exactly, exactly, and you know, and a lot, and I mean, and a lot of these towns had 800 people, but you know, the timing of it was early March, winter's getting over, planting season's about to begin. Most of these guys in these rural towns, some, especially in a farming area, somewhat isolated from everybody else, so it became a big celebration. The local women's auxiliary attached to the church would put on a fabulous spread, and the town meeting used to stop for 3 hours, and everybody would go over to, you know, the local Grange Hall and have lunch, and then they'd come back and conduct the town business. And it's pure form democracy. You know, do I have a nomination from the floor? Yeah, I nominate so and so. Well, he's your cousin, he doesn't count. You know, that kind of stuff. But
they still do the school budgets that way in a lot of places around the country.
A lot of places still do town meeting, but it's done on a regular meeting schedule now instead of this. When we were doing this, most of the towns were still doing it the first, second, or third Saturday in March. Mm-hmm. And we covered 75 towns. We literally had a chart of today, 10 o'clock, and it would also coincided with high school basketball tournament time, which was in our area was held in Bangor, where they would invite 3 divisions of schools. Basically, the entire northern part of the state would show up in Bangor, and the first day was like 19 hours of continuous high school basketball. The next day, after eliminations, was 12 hours. But it was like a 3-day tournament. The entire state would show up in Bangor, and some of these folks hadn't been to Bangor since last year. So, and so we had 4 photographers, and we've got 8 reporters, and we're trying to figure out how to chart, how to get them from this town to this town and this town. And again, with no internet, no ability to stop, jam a story into your computer and move on, these folks would do 3 of them, file 3 stories, go on to the next 3, and they would do 6 meetings in a day. It was like planning a military campaign, because the timing of it had to be exact. And if you had a meeting that ran late, you know, then what do we do with this one? You know,
or bad weather, and I mean, very often you would have bad weather.
Oh yeah, and especially in mud season, some of the roads are out, and
or you could get a blizzard in March. That wasn't even unusual.
No, absolutely. But that's what made covering news in that section made so much fun. I mean, we didn't look at that as work. It was like, okay, let's go do this. We know how to do this. It's just a matter of rolling up our sleeves and going to do it. And it was fun. It was just the most fun you could ever have, you know?
Well, when I lived in New England, what I noticed was that a lot of the people who came to these meetings lacked social skills, to put it mildly. They didn't know how to communicate effectively. They called names. They weren't very good with vocabulary. They didn't express themselves clearly. They repeated themselves a lot. They repeated somebody else a lot. So to add insult to injury, if you're an ordinary person with a good education coming from somewhere else to these town meetings, it is the most frustrating, tedious, and boring experience you can possibly imagine. Plus, people get really upset.
Oh yeah, fights. So it would depend on the moderator. I mean, we had one that the moderator was an auctioneer. He ran the entire town meeting in 45 minutes, and I was talking to the reporter. He said, "How do you do it?" And he said, he ran like an auction. He gave everybody 30 seconds to make their point, and he moved on. It was like he was taking bids. What am I bid for this highway project? Who's got 5 votes? You know, banging the gavel. Next question. Just ran right through it. It was probably the most hilarious town meeting anyone had ever covered, because this guy was not going to brook anything. You know, I'm sorry, your time limit's done. Sit down, shut up. Who's next?
Right.
You know?
They should all have somebody like that, I swear. Some of the meetings I went to, I wanted to tear my hair out.
Yeah.
It was so frustrating.
It's you know, sometimes it's time to drag out those old family chestnuts, and, you know, they would give time for people, you know, someone somewhat prominent may have died in the winter, and the family would get up, and the eulogies would go on for an hour if you let them, you know.
Yeah.
But there's something about that speaks to the nature of those small towns, the closeness of it, and especially I lived in Albion, which was a dairy farming town. Everyone's interests coincided at some point, because this was a time when developers would drive up and down the road willing to write $1 million checks for your farm. The milk price war was going on because milk prices are set on a regional basis. Maine always gets a premium because of higher fat content, which is used by ice cream makers. But over time, the federal pricing system was being gauged by farmers out in the Midwest, the big factory farms. And the local guys had to fight for their price. And there was a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And the guy I rented a house from, his family had been in the dairy business for 125 years.
Wow.
We lived in his mother's family's house, and he lived in his father's family's house. And there was a milk strike going on. Guys were dumping milk alongside the road, and Bobby just said, "Well, you know, I can weather this for a month, but I'm not going to pour out my product because then I have no money coming in. So if I sell slightly below production costs for a few weeks, I'm okay," because he had no debt on his farm, which helped him tremendously. But you know, it was you see, it looked like simple farm life, but underneath it there's politics and economics and world class questions that affect how these guys did their job. And
Yeah.
you could see it in places. There was a big farm in Fairfield that was sold, and we had signed a woman who was covering Fairfield for us, grew up in Chicago, and she didn't quite understand why it was such a big deal. And I said, "Here, go out, here's what you're looking for. You're looking for a farm family who'd been there for 150 years, possibly selling off the family legacy. You're looking at easily developed land near a highway, hundreds of houses, hundreds of stores, changing the entire nature of that thing. Plus you've got the preservation crowd who's going to be there." Turned out that the farm ended up being sold to a land trust and farm group, so they preserved, and that farm is still there. But she came back from that meeting and said, "Okay, now I get it." And
Yeah,
I said,
good.
look,
Good.
look. I said, look at these towns that you're in, and look at the pressure that's there. Can these farmers continue to make money just being farmers, or are there other schemes that they have to get involved in order to offset the loss of income that naturally comes through being a farmer? Your crop does not always get the highest maximum price.
Right.
So,
Well,
you
so
know,
I want to bring up some other part of your background here and go over to your website, because I can see why you have a poetic soul. I can see that all of that time spent out in nature and with the echoes of floods and farm conversations and all the different ways you have to relate to the weather in such a harsh environment is going to influence the kind of artist that you are. And so you have this poem on your website, and would you read it for us?
I'd be glad to. Thank you. This is called "Light That Lingers." It's somebody kind of reflecting on a relationship that didn't quite happen, and it goes like this. Actually, I wrote this back in July. Sometimes when I write poetry, it's one or two drafts, and that's sort of that old journalism training. You sit down, you focus, and you write. So this is how it goes. It is your face, that sweet light that lingers, eyes direct, desire and mischief, then dark with thought, lips so full your natural smile, the one that curls your mouth into a cockeyed grin, not the smile so coldly perfect it dazzles, but the one with the crooked worried lower lip, the one of love and loss and uncertainty, the one that invites. I hadn't expected it. A crowd like a blur passing, sounds a jumble then fading, time like crystal stopping. And we, the day before unknown, stood steamingly still at the center of that swirl, expecting, without reason, the other would be there. That is the tease, that wink, your moist tongue and an open mouth. Come, love the mystic dark energy. The taste of each, searching, giving. Lying together, your face would be soft, your skin like powder. Your eyes would flash with desire, then darken with question. A kiss for each, lingering lips to taste your light. What holds as the edges fray to atoms, and the atoms rattle like time into memory. To old men in straw hats rocking on a shaded porch, mopping away time with white handkerchiefs, we would be a dream, a ripple in the dimness of youth. I remember her, one would say, and the other would nod. Shared nostalgia, forgetting the surprise, the joy, then the void, the memory painless. What should have been stillness was motion. Instead of saying, we ricocheted, collided, the emotions raw, spun away bruised, trailing an ache behind, unsettled mist. Curse the old men in soft remembrances, the fog of time. Curse the distance, the loss. Bless instead your open soul on the light that lingers.
Oh, that's really lovely, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love the way that you get into describing her lips, but also by doing that, you really bring in aspects of her personality. And, you know, that's a real art to do that with a poem like that. Or I bet you do that a lot with your descriptions of your characters, too, that you take a physical feature and you make it possible for everyone to understand the person better just by describing them the way you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think writing, certainly in a visual age where people would rather look at pictures than read sometimes, you have to give them a better picture of what you're seeing. So you, and in writing fiction, a good example is in a game called Dead. Have a lawyer named Bruno Hapworth. He's one of these ambulance chaser lawyers. He always is in court filing ridiculous lawsuits against anybody and everybody for any client that will pay him. And he's described as short and thin. His suits don't fit. His face looks is rat-like. And Frank Nagler, the cop, who's the main character in these stories, knows him forever because he tells him at one point, Bruno, you wasted more of my time in court than practically any lawyer in the city. But Nagler reacts to Bruno's voice particularly because Bruno always pronounces his name Naglar in two words with this real nasal intonation. And Nagler describes it as you know, rocks rattling in his head. So it helps identify who this guy is. Turns out Bruno's not such a bad guy, but he comes across as this just the kind of lawyer nobody wants to deal with unless you're a criminal trying to get out of something really, really bad. You know, he's the kind of guy who will take your case, get it into court, and somehow get the charge reduced because you just beat the judge to death with motion after motion after motion, and finally everybody throws up their hands and say, "Okay, pay a fine and go away." You know,
Yeah.
but you want your readers to be able to visualize, and some of that comes from being a journalist and standing out there. With the notion that I'm the one at the accident scene, I'm the one in court, I'm the one at the breaking news story about a fatal accident, or one time I was up in Newton, New Jersey, where a propane truck had the valve broken off, and for like 3 hours there was just shooting flame coming out of the back of the truck in the middle of the population. Everybody was just, you know, it's one of those things. Why are we standing here? Because if this thing blows up, we're dead. But you never actually move away from it. You just have to sort of watch. So you stand behind a car just in case, but you're watching this flame burn for 3 hours. And it was a surprise to everybody because they actually thought that the tank was nearly empty when in fact it was nearly full, and they couldn't move it until it burned out. You know, so you can imagine the scene. But what you had to remember is that your readers aren't there, so you have to be able to put them in a frame that lets them understand the setting, the action, and who's doing what. So you pay attention to those descriptive details. Excuse me. And with fiction, you try to do the same thing. You want to create a setting that becomes instantly recognizable for the reader. And in a series like the Frank Nagler series, the setting of the town of Ironton, New Jersey is just as important as Frank. and since he's part of the thing here with them is that he's a native of the town, which has seen both good and bad economic times, and he's kind of lived through both. And part of the series is about both his transition from this grumpy old person to a human being, and the town's transition from really bad economic times to maybe better economic times. We don't know how that's going to play out, but you link the two in transition, and that becomes how that whole piece works. But you need to be able to describe the setting so that readers sit in and understand that this is what it's like growing up here, and that's what it's like now. So.
Well, I think you've just raised a very important point. I don't know how much you've been paying attention this week on, do you listen to NPR or follow along with the MacArthur Foundation Fellows any year? Do you ever look into those?
I used to follow, it's funny, I used to follow stuff religiously, probably looking at, when there were newspapers, read 4 or 5 newspapers a day. As it's all gone digital, I find that I scan it, but don't pay as much attention to it, because I find this. I was listening to NPR a few months ago on the radio, and they used to have, and I think this is a response to the listeners saying we need shorter stories. So they would take a topic, like taxation or something like that, and they would present one side and they say come back tomorrow and get the other side, and it's like, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Put them both together.
Yeah.
What
no, they want people to keep listening. They're trying to set up a series or a sequel or something.
It's all become marketing.
Well, the reason I brought it up was not that. The reason I brought it up was that there's a woman who just won one of the 24 fellowship grants from the MacArthur Genius Grant Foundation. They give once a year to somewhere between 20 and 30 people of varying ages and all different kinds of backgrounds and professions and artistic and scientific and economic and environmental interests. And this woman, an African-American woman, I'm sorry I can't remember her name, but there was a story about her yesterday on NPR, and they had her talk about her work. She's a photographer, and she won this grant because of work she's been doing in one of the towns in Pennsylvania that used to be a steel town. And over the last 60 years or so, as you know, almost all the steel towns have deteriorated because all the steel mills downsized and then have mostly closed in America. And so she decided to do it through a series of photographs of her grandmother and her mother and herself and other people she knew in this neighborhood, and wanted to tell the story of how the environment, the setting, and the people were interdependent, the way you were just talking about, and how their rise and fall didn't just correlate, but kind of interdependently caused each other's consequentially and emotionally and personality and social networking kinds of ways. Everything's been influenced by these changes in these towns, and she wanted to chronicle that. And the interviewer asked her, well, doesn't that make you feel bad? Because, this has already happened and there's nothing you could do about it. And don't you feel really powerless? She goes, no, on the contrary, I feel really powerful because this is the first time that anyone has taken the stories of ordinary people and really looked at the impact of these economic and environmental and political changes on individuals and families. And now our story, which is usually not in the history books, will be read, will be seen, will be talked about. And I thought that was brilliant, and I was really happy to hear her story. And it reminded me of what you were saying, like the setting is a character in a lot of people's stories and needs to be addressed that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that the books I've written are anywhere on the same level, but I think of a model as the John Updike Rabbit books, where Brewster and its environs were intrinsic to everything that happened to Harry Angstrom. And his progression was the town's progression. And, people are connected to where they live in ways that sometimes they don't think about. If you've lived in a town even for 10 years, and in the last 10 years, probably what happened is shopping centers were built, schools were changed, You know, new people moved in. The population of the town increased maybe 50%. Some towns were out in the part of New Jersey where I live, they had their population double in 5 years. So there's always this concern: does the old part of town get overrun? You know, who remembers the history of the town and things like that?
Or do they build a highway that bypasses it and kills it?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That we saw that. Or example, a town. My younger sister lives in southeast West Virginia, and about 20 years ago, Highway 64 was built through, and you had that a classic highway commercial impact. I mean, immediately within a half a mile in either direction of that highway exit, where there used to be farmland, was now shopping centers, just like that. And so you have that impacted, you know, and the downtown of Lewisburg went through a tough time because all the shops moved out, but they've all moved back. And that's the thing that's interesting to watch in a lot of these towns, is once they think about it, somebody says, we live here for a reason. Let's go back and talk about those reasons. And they find ways of reinvigorating their downtowns. They bring in farmers markets. They bring in arts. They bring in, they convince the local jeweler who, you know, moved to the mall that, you know, here's a cheap rental for a year. Why don't you move a shop in here and see what happens?
Yeah.
We look over at Easton, PA, which is across the river from where I live. They're undergoing a renaissance. They got a couple of government projects underway. Crayola moved in with their factory store about 15 years ago, and suddenly there's dozens of new restaurants and new shops. There's turnover. Some of them don't succeed, but what they also brought in was the idea that on these second and third and fourth stories of these buildings, let's put condos and apartments. Let's get people moving back into downtown.
Right.
So that they all don't live in the suburbs and don't have to drive here. And suddenly that town and the town across the river near where I live, Phillipsburg, the downtown areas are suddenly busy. You know,
Yes.
You're seeing new stores, you're seeing investment. In Phillipsburg, an old short-line railroad group about 15 years ago just started offering excursions up and down the Delaware River on these rattly old steam trains. Well, now they bring in thousands of people a year. They've managed to attract investment from big companies. Thomas the Tank Engine comes here for 4 weeks.
Oh, that's fun for the kids,
Yeah,
right?
we go down. We take our grandson down there, and there's thousands of people. They run a Polar Express. In fact, it's so popular, you have to buy your tickets in July because it's sold out.
Wow.
You know, so
people are getting very creative about how to bring in tourism and how to bring in more neighbors,
you know,
and make a neighborhood and make it feel good to be there.
These were old railroad towns, you know, and these rail lines were abandoned, and you got a bunch of local guys who invested in figuring out the steam engines, and suddenly it's this year-round business. And if people think about that, they can reinvest in their town, and suddenly all of those abandoned downtowns start to show some life, and it makes it's just one of those things that it goes beyond the political question.
Well, it brings up a hope for people that love little bookstores, because what killed the little bookstores were the malls and the big Barnes and Nobles and Border stores, and then of course the online shops. But if people start shopping in downtowns again and walking around and browsing and wanting to be in a nice place to look at books, that's what a good independent bookstore is for.
Yeah, and you see these operators taking advantage of the technology. They're all Wi-Fi centers. They have all the connections. You know, they bring in the car, they bring in an espresso machine, and you know, they get a good pastry baker, and they're up and running. And
that's it. Yeah.
The idea is to get people, and from the municipal side, the town officials have to make sure there's parking. And once you solve the parking issue, the rest of it takes care of itself. You know, I mean, so what happens, like on the train days in Phillipsburg, there's 3 or 4 municipal parking lots. they run a trolley shuttle back and forth. So
Brilliant.
there's buses all over town moving people. Once you make it easier for people to get around to see these events, they show up.
So you bring this into your stories, the way these towns are changing and how the characters are changing in concert with these towns?
Yeah, because in the first one, things are really bad in Ironton. The mills are closed. Hurricane shows up and wipes out, everything. And the bad guys in the book burn down an old factory and kill a bunch of people. And there's a sense of sort of doom and gloom. And I had written some social commentary stuff, and that was the hardest thing to fit into the story because I had to find a character to deliver it. First, I tried to have the narrator do it, and that didn't work. Then I have a character named Jimmy Dawson, who's a reporter. Had him try to do it, and it really didn't work because it wasn't his kind of style. And I was at a planning board meeting, of all things, and the attorney doing the presentation's last name was Bartholomew. And I was driving home thinking about the meeting, and the name stuck. And I said, that's the name I need. So I came up with a character named Bartholomew Harrington, who was a disreputable old attorney who's sort of become the town crank. And he was the guy who now delivers all of this underground social commentary. And in a couple of scenes, puts on these theatric presentations and brings it all out.
Oh, great. He's doing the polemic for you.
He's doing the polemic, and he's funny. He just came out of nowhere. It was one of those things. I wrote it. It was like a one right through, especially the one scene in Town Hall that where he confronts the candidates for mayor. I sort of envisioned it as a Shakespearean character coming in after or just before a big tragedy. Shakespeare will take a comic scene to frame, and then he'll go off and kill people.
Oh, right, like he used Polonius in Hamlet.
Yeah, in Hamlet or any of the comedies, he does that.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of what I had in mind. And and Bart Harrington comes in, and he dresses weirdly, and he's just. He was described in the book as in court. He was this theatrical attorney, bordering on overacting most of the time, and he falls back to that. And there's this wonderful scene where he's just running around Town Hall, handing out flyers and yelling at the candidates and all sorts of stuff. In the second book,
which is called
A Game Called Dead. It'll be. The release date is January 7th from Imzadi Publishing. In the second book, the urgency and emergency of the flood are gone, but nothing happened in 2 years. There's piles of dirt, empty houses, and all sorts of things like that. But one of the scenarios is this underground group of kids working with the local community center director, who suddenly takes up the issue. And in that book, what I was trying to do, and it sort of happened by accident, as it happens with fiction sometimes, I try to use sound as the way of showing that there's life in the city. And the first time that Frank Nagler, the detective, runs into this, he's driving up the road, and he keeps hearing all of this noise, and it sounds like it's just machines. And he gets there, and it's this made-up drum line of kids with 55-gallon drums and plastic tubs and stuff like that, sort of reenacting an official drum line, but it's all made-up stuff. They made up their instruments. And he does this there's about 2 paragraphs. It's just literally just sound. And I hope it reads well enough, because it's hard to, I can't create it unless you read it. But that becomes the motif by which you show some growth. Later on in the book, Nagler is showing a college professor who wants to write a book about the serial killer, the places where the serial killer worked and committed his crimes. And she's never been in Ironton and she thinks it's just this dirty old crappy city, and he tries to show her as he's driving around that it's not so, and stops at one point and says, listen. And he rolls down the window of the cars, and filtering over all the street noise is this whole drumming, singing thing, because the kids are over at this other store, which is key to the whole book, making music. And so at one of the climactic scenes is this police hunt with this urban march for better treatment in the city, and you kind of mash it all together, and I hope it works. But one of the scenes there is the director of this community center who leads the march. He walks in, and there's a piece of this on my website, www.Stephen Daigle, M-I-C-H, how do I spell my name?
A-E-L.
STEPHENDAIGLE.com. It's called I Have a Shovel. And Rashad Jackson walks in front of the car with a shovel and says, I have a shovel. We know how to rebuild this damn town, and moves on. And it becomes intrinsic. Now in the next one, I have to take that piece of energy. I don't quite, you're not going to have this town go from being a downtrodden, old, underinvested city to becoming, New York City in one book. There's a transition in this, just as there's a transition in Frank Nagler going from being this grumpy old person in the first book who's still getting over the death of his wife to being in a new relationship, and how that works. I mean, it takes a couple of books to do it. Well,
you're talking about the third book now is the next one, The Weight of Living?
The Weight of Living is the third book, and I'm sort of figured out what I'm going to do with that.
And weight is W-E-I-G-H-T.
Right. I was reading The Book Thief, that great book about the girl in World War II in Germany.
She's reading to that guy who can't read.
You can't read, and the phrase just popped into my head. And actually, I had this debate with the Nagler books. The first one, the game called Dead was originally the first book. And when I thought of a series of books, it's like, do I play on the idea of game as the theme? But when I moved a game called Dead from New York to New Jersey, and it became the Swamps of Jersey, I threw that whole idea out. So I had to come up with a third. Decided that the titles are going to be irrelevant, except how they relate to the story being told. So The Weight of Living is the next title. Now I have to, and I wrote it down and said, that's an impressive title. I better write a really good story behind it.
It does sound a little bit Faulkner-esque or Hemingway-esque or something like that.
But, the thing is I think the second book is so different than the first one. And I think the connections between the action and the characters is closer. And that's part of the process of writing. Every book, every story is a learning experience of how you approach your material. You have to be willing to accept the fact that the goal that you started when you wrote down the first word might not be where you end up.
That happens to me all the time. In the same paragraph or in the same chapter, I don't end up where I think I'm going to end up. And in my books, it's much more fun because I can move things around. I'm not writing chronologically. I'm writing as if all time is simultaneous and people actually know it. Right. And so I have date lines on all my chapters, but they do not go in sequence. In fact, I spent hours over the last week or so putting everything in sequence just to make sure I didn't have anything that shouldn't be somewhere from book to book, because I'm on book 4 now. And so if I'm saying that the main character is in Sweden on such and such a day, I can't have her be somewhere else on the same day in a different book. Although I could, because in my books, there are alternate timelines. And not everything happens the same way all the time. But still, I didn't want to have glaring problems where people would be like, wait a minute, this person doesn't have a kid and now they have a kid. And, it's not impossible, but I wasn't going to really try to mess with people that much. It took me hours and hours and hours to organize all that.
I can say, and the thing is, you want to surprise your readers, but you don't want to scare them. You don't want them to stop and say, wait a minute, how did we get here? I
Right.
don't understand that. Because then you've lost them in the thread, and what they're going to be thinking about is how you're going to bring that thread back in. You want them to be surprised by where the thread goes, but not have to scope out how you actually did it. Once they start doing that,
thumbing through all the other books to figure
Yeah.
out how this connects, you know.
yeah, I mean, but the thing that we said before about, I think, the Spanish series, and the challenge there, as I'm looking at it, is you're writing the future in present tense.
And the past. Everything's
And
in
the
present
past,
tense.
yeah. So that's an amazing undertaking, and it's a question of how you plan it, how you execute it, and how you keep the reader engaged so that they follow those. I mean, you know, like when you're watching Doctor Who, you understand that he's going to go in the TARDIS and be out in outer space, and the next thing he's going to be in downtown London, and you don't question that it happens. You know, when you're writing that story, that's what you have to do. You have to understand that the reader is going to take that leap with you.
Yes, that's exactly right. And speaking of leaps, I am so sorry to have to tell you and all of our viewers that are watching now or later, it is 1:45.
Okay.
Unbelievable as it may seem. And that is the time I always take a moment and ask our guest the big question that goes with the theme of my show, Changes, Conversations Between Authors, which is episodic, but then it has this one common thing in all of the different episodes, which is that I'm an author and you're an author. And the second common thing is I ask you this question. So, given all of the local, personal, regional, or provincial or state, national, global, spiritual or religious, scientific or technological, political or economic, environmental or climatic, or any other kinds of changes you're aware of, including artistic and musical, poetic and otherwise. What are the changes that arouse in you fear? What are the changes that evoke hope? Tell us about your take on changes. Michael Stephen Daigle.
Change is inevitable. Change is going to, it's not something to be feared. As a parent who raised 2 kids and now in their early 20s, you can't be locked into what your parents told you. I mean, I grew up in the 50s. My father was military. There's a certain type of lifestyle that comes from that. We moved around a lot. All 5 of the kids in my family were born in different states. My kids were born in New Jersey and lived here for the first 20 years of their life. That affects how they look at things. You expose them to as much as you possibly can. The internet has given them greater opportunities to get into stuff that I at 18 or 17 didn't have that, unless you spent all day in the library, but no kid spends all day in the library unless you're perhaps Stephen Hawking, but so I look, and as a reporter over 30 years, you look at how change occurs on a broad scale. There are, we're seeing it in the national political discussion, what appear to be a whole gang of crazy people leading the argument. Historically, there's always been a gang of crazy people. They have a little more influence, I think, because of the internet and the loss of the daily newspaper that existed when I started in the business. So people are getting their information from scattered websites, mostly one-topic websites, point of view websites, and they tend to get narrowly focused. We overcome that because somewhere along the line, collectively, we slap ourselves upside the head and say, that's not how we got here. That's not what the general good is. And our body politic will fall back into, you hate to say you fall back into the lesser of 2 evils, but you fall back towards candidates on a national level who understand the general good nature of what gets done in governments, what gets done in private economies, what gets discussed in people's homes, what happens in schools. And we're starting to see some mode of reaction. Everyone talks about the Koch brothers buying the last election. They spent billions of dollars and actually didn't gain a huge number of influential candidates. They're spending money now. Their chief beneficiary, Scott Walker, dropped out because you can't, you can influence an election, but you can't, in these days, I don't think you buy one. What happens is the money is being used to influence the decision making once people are in office, and that's why we have so many bad pieces of bill being surfaced, and why we spend all this time discussing stuff that should get just blown away. But but that goes out in the wash. We've gone through these periods historically where the crazies lead the pack, but then the crazies fall away, and the good common sense that exists in this country begins to take hold. And I think, and we're talking about a presidential election that's 13 months away. I'll get worried about it sometime about 6 months from now, when all the chatter is beginning to disappear, and you've got a collection of the best and most serious candidates left. You see it on the local level. I mean, I live in a town where we had a group of politicians who were here in power for about 15 years, and they were connected to the old guard in the town. They all decided they wanted to get on with their lives and left office over a number of years. They're replaced by a group of fire breathers who think that all government is wrong and we're going to fix it and make it run like a business. And the first thing our mayor did was hack into the police video system so he could spy on employees. I mean, and it's like, what? You got elected to spy on your employees. Why would that even be considered a good practice in the business you just left? If you did that, your business, you'd be fired. So this got to be a one-term mayor, and hopefully he won't do any damage in the meantime. I would like him to spend $5 more fixing our street the next time, so when they repave it, they actually fix the drainage, instead of just paving it over. But we run into this. But what happens is a common sense, and I think we're beginning to see this discussion in terms of use of tax dollars. Everyone's tired of driving on bad roads. Everyone's tired of these monumentally bad decisions that are made. New Jersey's about to run out of transportation money. They're going to have to raise the gas tax at some point because they can't fix the roads. Pennsylvania 2 years ago raised the gas tax, and as far as I can tell, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is still functioning, and people are driving safely to work every day, and life
I
goes.
think what you bring up is important, because what we've seen over the last 50 years, you and I are close in age, and what we've seen in our young adult life and going forward is a lot of corruption being exposed, a lot of lying, a lot of fraud, a lot of squandering and misuse of resources, from the $7,000 screwdrivers that are approved in the Pentagon to all the different embezzlement and graft and bribery that is continually going on, and not just in New Jersey, it's almost everywhere. And how about that group in California that just paid themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars of whatever money they could get? It's a tiny little town in Southern California. How did they get away with that for so long?
The generational crime in small towns is amazing. There was a small town in South Jersey where basically it was a club. You had to agree to keep the scheme in place in order to be approved to run for office. And it was this whole payoff scheme.
No. Well, I don't want to give one more minute. No, I'm not giving one more minute to that political corruption, because we only have 5 more minutes.
Okay.
And what I'd like to do is give our last shout outs and tell people where they can find you again and what's coming up for you. So why don't you go ahead and do that?
Okay. What is coming up is the publication, hopefully in January, of a game called Dead, which is the second Frank Nagler mystery. I think this one, in terms of the book itself, actually, I think this is a better book in the sense that I tried to do something different with it. you try to experiment a little bit. And I wanted this one to be faster paced and get the characters closer to the action without having to stop and do soliloquies and stuff like that.
Great.
And for
well,
the
I have
most
to stop
part,
you. I have to stop you because you don't have time to do that. All you have time to do now is make announcements.
All right. So you can find me at Facebook in my name. I'm on Twitter at God, whatever it is.
50. It starts with a 50.
Yeah, it's 50 Eagle 50.
So it's 50 EAGLE 50.
50.
That's on Twitter.
My website is Michael Michael Stephen StephenDaigle.com. That's where I post announcements and samples and poems and things like that. It's a fun thing, and it's always interesting to see how many people from Bosnia sign on. But you know,
well, you also have something interesting going on. I just want to make sure we mention where you've set some of your poetry to a narrator reading it with music in the background. And so people can go listen to that on your website. Yes.
That was interesting because a friend of mine, I wrote the poem, put it up on the website, and Diane Havens, who I got to know through some reporting I did at the newspaper I was working at, is a voice artist. She's recorded maybe half a dozen pieces of mine, and you can find her on SoundCloud by searching for her name, Diane, DianeHavens. So she recorded this poem called Reentry, and she's very evocative. She's a very talented voice artist. And unbeknownst to both of us, this musician from Holland picked up her reading of it and wrote music to it.
Wow.
And
serendipity, huh?
Yeah. So on my website under Reentry is both the poem and the musical piece, and it was just a thrill.
Great.
To think that somebody was that interested in that, to take the time, and it's a nice evocative piece. And apparently, this is one of the things that this guy does all the time. He had several pieces, so it was kind of fascinating to see, and it's a real interesting listen.
Thank you for explaining that.
It just shows the great possibility of this stuff. You don't know who's paying attention or what they're going to do with it. And so we did this, and it's sort of this accidental collaboration, and it turned out to be very interesting. So
okay, so I want to let people know how to get in touch with me and what's going on next on Changes. Next week we have Jean-François Debeau, who is from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and I said everything in that wrong because I'm not French, but he speaks perfect English, and you'll be able to listen to him next week, October 7th on Changes, 10 o'clock Eastern time on YouTube if you don't want to comment, and on Google Plus if you do. And then after that, I have a lot of openings. So if you're an author, a writer, a journalist, a blogger, nonfiction or fiction, poets, any kind of screenwriting or playwriting, any kind of writer is welcome to go to my website, sallyember.com, SALLYEMBER.com, and go to the Changes page on my website and read about how to get on my show and follow the directions. And then you can contact me at the appropriate point in those steps. Thank you for, in advance, following the steps. Please don't email me if you haven't gone to my website and read the directions, because I'll just send you back to it. Okay, and then I also want to let people know that just like anything, I run on money. And this is free, and everything I do here is free. But getting my books into print is not free. And getting them to put this video cast into a podcast onto a server is not free. And I have some other goals too. So if you want to support me, I have a crowdfunding campaign on Patreon, patreon.com/SallyEmber, SALLYEMBER. And coming up for me is a new release of the third book in my Spanner series. This book is called This Is / Not the Way I Want Things to Change. And it's got Clara and the aliens and her family and some friends and some of her older kids and nieces and nephews and all those people involved, again, in learning a lot about what's going on in the first 5 years of the transition. And that will be available as an ebook for pre-orders starting November 1st with a great cover reveal on Alicia Escobar's site on October 26th. Covered by I, Donna Willow Raven. And then it will go through pre-orders until it releases for real on December 8th. Pre-orders are half price. I encourage pre-orders. All ebooks for now until I can get my books to be in print. So thank you all very much for enjoying this show now or whenever you're enjoying it. For those of you who wish you could have commented, please comment at any point and ping me or ping Michael by making sure our name turns blue when you write the comment by putting a plus or an @ sign in front of it. And then we'll be able to know that you've commented and respond. So again, thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sally. This was great fun. It's always fun to get together and talk to people about writing and life and stuff. And yeah, you know, as I do more writing and get involved with this stuff, just learning about how to reach audiences is always fascinating. And learning about this is something to take part in. It's congratulations on starting this, because clearly you've provided a venue for people like me who are sort of technologically ignorant. I mean, I know this stuff is out there, but I haven't got a clue how to make it work. And learning how to do it, make it work is a great service for the people who are looking for an audience. And every author out there is looking for an audience.
That's
no matter
true.
what they say.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for being on the show. Thanks to all of my previous and upcoming guests for tuning in, all of our readers, listeners, and viewers. And as I say at the end of every show, go well with your changes.
There you go. Thank you. Outstanding.